Hello and welcome to Identerati Office Hours, episode 30, OpenFGA Deep Dive with Andres and Damien from Okta on the OpenFGA team. And this continues our chat on authorization, which I think will continue for many more episodes this year and next year. Before we get started, I'd just like to ask everyone to follow Identerati Office Hours on LinkedIn. Hit that little follow button. We're trying to get to 1,000 followers, and you'll get more exclusive Identerati event invitations like this one. And so our guest is Andres. Damien's a co-host. So maybe I could start with some quick introductions. Andres, maybe you could tell us, like, how did you find yourself on a Identerati Office Hours live stream?
Good question. Hi, everyone, and happy to be here. So I've been working for the last few years on a project that is called OpenFGA, that is trying to help solving authorization for developers. That's part of my work at Okta. I joined Okta as part of the Auth0 acquisition when I started working with Damien. That was 7 years ago, so I've been for a while in the identity space. But as Mike checked in my LinkedIn profile, I've been here for a while, and from the working on tech from the previous century, and before working at Okta, I always worked in developer products. So, but first in a company in Uruguay, and then in a company in the US that was focused more on developer for UI components. But this is my first time working developer products for identity. It was the past 7 years of my life working on that. So happy to be here.
All right, thank you, Andres. And Damien, I highly approve of your fashion choice. Being a hardcore Yankees fan myself. But can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got involved in OpenFGA?
Yeah, sure, definitely. So like Andres, I was, in my case, lucky to also start my career working on products for developers. When I started, we did a lot of consulting for Microsoft, working on what was back in the day patterns and practices libraries and developer platform evangelist. And then when Auth0 started, I met one of the founders at my previous company, Matthias, and so I got the chance to be an early engineer at Auth0. Got to build a lot of like the teams and the product, and came into Okta as part of the Auth0 Okta acquisition. And part of my job at Okta today is I lead the team that does what we call research and development. It's called Auth0 Lab. And that team created OpenFGA and OktaFGA as we were researching kind of like solutions to the authorization problem. So that's kind of like how I came to be here.
So OpenFGA is a relational-based access control architecture. And Andres, what kind of problems lend themselves to this relational approach to authorization?
Yeah, so in general, if you think about most applications, you have a way that users relate between each other, like the users belong to groups, to roles, to customers, like in a B2B scenario. And also you also have the resources of your application that also have relationships between each other, right? A folder, a document, a project, a ticket, a bank account, the account manager. Right? So at some moment, you can find ways to relate resources and way to relate users, and then relate resources to users, right? So it's pretty easy to model most applications and most authorization systems in a relationship-based way. It struggles a little when decisions are more based on attributes that cannot be specified as relationships, like the current time or things like that, right? But in general, for most attributes that you have in a user, like there are relationship with something, like the department is a relationship with a department, the manager is a relationship with another user, right? So you can express most of the entities that are related when you want to make an authorization decision in terms of relationship between two entities. And that's the plan, and that's the way that we use to define authorization policies.
So Damien, Andres, you're on the product side, and Damien, you're more on the architecture side. As somebody who's been working with enterprises and authorization for a long time, I found that it can be pretty intimidating to developers and enterprises to externalize the policies and authorization. What is your how do you see developers and the business authoring policies, and what are the tools available today, and how do developers or companies get started with this type of solution?
I think you hit on the right nail when you said start by thinking about externalizing, right? Because whether you're using kind of like attribute-based access control, as Andres was mentioning, specific attributes, or you're using relationship-based access control, authorization based on relationships, you could still do that inside your application, right? You could run SQL queries to check for relationships. You could fetch data and do that in your application logic. And what you're doing is you're coupling your app to that authorization logic. And authorization is interesting because you need to be fast, you need to be reliable, right? You need to run it on every operation. So the first thing is once you decide to externalizing, you need to figure out where you're going to make that authorization decision. Is it going to be as part of kind of like your edge? Is it going to be one of like your internal reverse proxies? Is it going to be part of your like your framework logic in your app, but clearly kind of like modularized out of your app logic? Where are you going to do that? And then in the case of OpenFGA, what you do is you use a domain-specific language, which allows you to define, as Andres was mentioning, the types of objects in your app. You can think about them as classes in a programming language. Hey, I have modules, I have folders, I have users. And you define the relationships between those objects. And based on those relationships, you then define who can access what. The typical case might be if you think about file sharing apps like Google Forms. Hey, I have folders, I have files, and you can access a file if you can read the file, but you can also access it if you can write the file. And you can also access it if you're the admin for the folder, right? And then you kind of like start creating that, let's say, tree view of how that works. And one of the things that we provide is kind of like this visual editor that people are seeing on screen, where you can code the DSL on the top left. You start seeing a visualization of how that model works on the right. And then you have what we call assertions that allow you to define specific things that should happen. Think of it like unit tests, but for your authorization model. And this allows you to kind of like iterate on your model while avoiding regressions.
Okay, and let me undo that. So yeah, and I just had to show that because these new JavaScript tools are like so beautiful. Like they're half artwork and half technology. So I love that tool. Andres, on the business like product side, I'm wondering if you have an opinion, and you might not, about why Okta was very interested in authorization, because I wonder why wouldn't Okta just be on the sidelines and say, well, there's 20 different authorization solutions, our tokens and our identity is input to those. Why did Okta feel there was a need to actually build an authorization tool or product?
That's a good question, and there are two parts of that question, of answering that question. One is at Auth0, like in the Auth0 IDP, we have some features for implementing authorization, like role-based access control, the standard things that and that gets kind of when you log in, you get in your access token the specific claims that the user has based on their role. So the standard way of implementing role-based access control in an OAuth IDP. We always had that, right? But that fell short from a lot of use cases, right? For example, those permissions cannot be very fine-grained, right? If you want to edit a specific document, you cannot put the list of documents that you can edit in an access token, right? Because they can be millions potentially, right? So we've always felt that wasn't enough to solve authorization for developers, right? And in Auth0, our audience is developers. We want to help developers build applications that can solve for identity and access management, right? And the access management part wasn't finished if we didn't have something that let you go finer grained that a role on a permission that is very high level in very coarse claims. So we're always looking forward to solve that problem. Actually, in Damien's team, before they kind of found this solution for to implement authorization this way, they were iterating the problem for a while, right? Going to different paths to try to solve that problem. So one answer is it's kind of in the ADN of DNA of Auth0 to kind of try to solve those kind of problems. And we always wanted to solve it from a developer's perspective, right? And then there's another piece, which is if you think about authorization, and if you think about authentication, you have authentication in an application, right? That is what you build in the app. And then you have single sign-on, which is kind of the business side or the workforce side of login, right? So for a feature in the app, you have a feature in workforce or in the identity on the company identity side that is single sign-on. How do I log in to the application I built? And we have standards for that, right? SAML, OIDC, whatever, with the things we already know, right? For authorization, there's a similar story. You have authorization in your app, right? So which roles you have, which resource you can access. And then how you provision access to authorization. You provision that on Workforce with identity governance tools that lets you say, okay, this user has this role in this specific SaaS application. This user can access this resource in this specific SaaS application. Right? So now it starts getting more interesting because Okta has products for identity governance, right? And so if we help customers build authorization with something like OpenFGA, we can also help customers integrate with identity governance products, right? So in that place, there's a very few companies in the world that can do that can play well in the application developer space because they have a good developer audience and also have a good IT admin audience to talk about the workforce scenarios, right? So from that perspective, I actually believe that Okta is kind of the best place to be solving this problem right now, right?
So it was sort of a missing link. Like you could provide the roles of the person and you could make the policies about what those roles could do, but you were sort of missing this link about how the application would actually execute these policies. Is that a reasonable way to think about it?
Yeah, it's more like you have. Yes, go ahead, Damien.
Oh yeah, the thing is, as Andres put it, right? When you need to make an authorization decision, you need logic, code, right? Typically, people think about it as maybe an authorization policy. You might have code in your app, but you also need state. You need some data to make that decision. As Andres was explaining, when you need to make fine-grained decisions, like who can access a document based on granular collaboration, when permissions change often, that state needs to be highly available, it needs to be performant. And this is where the whole reason for coming up with a solution came up. As a developer, as someone building an application, state databases are a challenge. And what we have done since Auth0's inception is solve problems for developers so that they can focus on their app. Authentication was that, now authorization is the same thing. And the side effect of that is that once state is defined to work in a certain way, like relationship-based access control with something like the Zanzibar model that OpenFGA and OctaFGA follow, then if you have an identity governance product, you have certain guarantees about kind of like what's on the other side so that you can also make governance work in a predictable way.
And so the deployment model, actually my next question was about architecture, so I'm going to leave you in the hot seat, Damien. This deployment model is in the cloud. I see the projects at the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation at the Linux Foundation. And I think of those projects as Kubernetes native, like very cloud first types of technologies.
Yep.
And so is the deployment intention that this runs maybe as a sidecar OpenFGA engine, or does it run centrally? Or are you thinking about potentially maybe compiling your Go engine into a WebAssembly and actually running it in the app? So where does this engine actually run? I guess that's my question.
Yeah, so there are different ways to run OpenFGA, right? I think someone was asking the other day in chat, you can run it like as a sidecar or even in process. The idea is you can also run it as part of like a store. But the way we think about it is you have a centralized store, let's say Postgres database, and you connect to this service. This should be in your network. This should be highly reliable. Latency should be like low latency. And this is kind of like what you use across your apps. When you bring this in process, you're changing a few things around how caching works. You're changing a few things about latency between the client and the database. So that's not at least how we recommend to run it. And when you think about our cloud version, our own product, what we do is we run in the cloud provider in the same regions as our customers do. We have an active way of deploying things, and it's still a SaaS, but because we're in the same region as our customer, you get kind of like the low latency benefits of like intra environment or intra-region networking while still getting the benefits of SaaS.
I see. And go ahead, Andres. If you have a comment there, I have a follow-up question, but please, if you have follow-up thoughts on the architecture, I'd love to hear.
No, because I think something that maybe we kind of implied, but we never said explicitly, is that the way. Damien mentioned the Zanzibar approach, right? So Zanzibar, for people who don't know, it's the name of a technology or a system that is used internally at Google that they describe in a paper describing how it works. So it's not a product you can use. It's more like right now it's a paper that people read and try to follow their ideas, right? And the idea of that paper is that you have the policies and you have the data, and that's what the authorization system has: policies and data. In other approaches to doing access management, right, you only have the policy, and you need to provide the data when you evaluate the policy. Okay? So if you're using like a OPA or CEDAR, those technologies, you define the policy that you can execute, but somehow before invoking the policy, you need to get the data and provide the data to the policy. In the Zanzibar approach and the one we follow in OpenFGA and OptFGAs, you give us the data first. We have all the data. That creates some challenges because you need to give us the data, right? But once we have the data, we can answer those questions, those authorization questions pretty easy, right? Now, in a sidecar model, right, the question is, okay, I can run OpenFGA in a sidecar, but the data still needs to be centralized, right? Because I have multiple nodes of Kubernetes running, right? I want the data to be in the same place, right? So even if I run the services as a sidecar, it doesn't make a lot of sense, right? You will want to make a call to another service. The embedded scenario, sometimes it makes sense if you already have a service, right? So we have customers like for example, that they do this because they have a service that they auto-scale and they manage, and they want to make calls to FGA from there, right? And they can handle that, right? Other scenarios that are running in embedded is some customers are doing this for infrastructure scenarios. For example, Canonical is using this in most of the products. They're using it in a virtual machine container technology called LXD, right? And in LXD, they use an embedded FGA instance with an embedded database, okay, because they implemented their own database adapter, right? So it runs in the virtual machine thing, right? And they can get the benefits of a finite grained permission and more flexible authorization model.
Yeah, and one of the things I want to add, which is maybe not obvious, but again, once you start thinking about this relationship-based access control and the specific like Zanzibar paper, is what Zanzibar and what FGA systems conceptually do, like again, systems that are based on that Zanzibar paper, is they restrict the queries that you can run on the data to make authorization decisions. And those restrictions give you some guarantees around like the upper bounds for latency and like how it should work from a kind of like what you can replicate, reliability, and so on. So what's the opposite of that? It's what Andres was mentioning. If you have pure policies and you have to figure out how to get the data for a policy into that runtime, let's say you have to make a decision about how, I don't know, purchasing a product. So you need to get user data to make that authorization decision, but you also need to get product data to get that decision. And you might also need to get, I'm making things up, right? Credit card data. And let's say you have, like, I'm going to use quotes now, microservices, something that became very popular. So now you have to go through 2 or 3 different databases to make one authorization decision. If one of those is down, authorization won't work. If one of those is slow, authorization will be slow. So yes, policies are a lot more flexible, but because as a developer, as a person building the system, you have to make sure that the data is available quickly, consistently, then you have a problem. What Zanzibar does is essentially restrict the queries that you can run, make it just relationships, put them in a centralized store that should be very fast, reliable, and then you no longer have that problem and you can run authorization at scale quickly and efficiently.
You know, when I started my career, I worked with a product called CA SiteMinder back in the 90s. And I built a tool for an insurance company to allow the business people to author policies. And, you know, for example, this vendor or this insurance broker sells our bus insurance, but not our fire insurance. So we wanted to delegate that to the business people. And we use SiteMinder to do this. But there was a limited number of policies. And what I see in the Google Doc sharing case is that now we have delegated policy making, not to like a small group of people, but to like a billion customers are now making policies about which, you know, who can see this document. And maybe you could just give us a little bit of context about why other systems fail to scale to solve that problem. So I didn't know who wants to take. Anyone want to?
Yeah,
Andres or
I
Damien?
can start. I can start, and probably Andres can share some kind of like customer use cases or interesting stories. So I think that you nailed it. Like this is what we started referring to as if you have an application where access is not defined by who you are or an admin, but rather by other users, you are in one of these dynamic fine-grained authorization scenarios, right? Because other users can go change what you can access. In those cases, first of all, you can't typically embed authorization data in a credential, like let's say a JSON Web Token that you might be using, because those applications tend to be dynamic. So the amount of documents grows over time, the token gets bloated, it can't go through proxies and so on. Because the permissions change, if you're using a JWT-based approach for authorization, the JWT becomes stale and you have to go renew it every time, which means that you're hitting the authorization server every time. That is not very useful because like, what are you gaining by putting the data in that token? So then you go into, okay, I need something that can handle these dynamic changes, frequent writes to a database, not extremely high scale because permissions don't change all the time, but they change often. And then when I go read it, it needs to be something that's fast enough that it can make an authorization decision on thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of objects, which means it needs to be fast for any of those. And typically, policies are not good at that, not because the policy can't handle it, but because you need a lot of databases behind it to coordinate to make that happen. And yes, you could do that by essentially kind of, I'm going to use quotes, materializing views, by materializing these relationships using caches. And that's essentially what FGA, what Zanzibar does, right? You have a cache of these relationships in a database that's meant to work for authorization.
And Andres, maybe you could talk a little bit about the decision to contribute this to CNCF. I was surprised by that. What was the reason for actually open sourcing the core engine?
So yeah, there are two decisions, right? One open sourcing it, and the other one donating it to the CNCF. We made them kind of together when we kind of decide about that, right? And but yes, so we believe there was going to be a major open source player in the space that was needed, that we needed to have an open source product for Zanzibar like implementations, and we believe that for this specific product, given that there's this part of the data integrations part, so we need to put data into the database for multiple systems, right? And also it needs to be embedded in their applications, maybe in API gateways. There's going to be a lot of opportunities of building integrations and tooling that the open source community could help a lot. That could be SDKs for different platforms, SDKs from different frameworks in specific languages, right? Like React or Angular, whatever, right? And the API integration with the hundreds or tens of API gateways that are in the system, right? Integrations with other data stores. Like I want to write the data in Postgres, in MySQL, whatever. I want to get data from different databases, get data from different systems like a directory or Salesforce, right? So there was a lot of things to build, and we thought that building that in the community will help everyone, right? And also it was also a bet on saying like if there's going to be a major player in the open source space, why not be us, right? So we can have a very solid product, a very solid SaaS offering, and also a very solid open source offering, right? And that is different from the things that we've been doing in the past with Okta and Auth0, where we had open source components, but the core technology wasn't open source. In this case, we made a different decision and tried this path.
And if I could ask a follow-on question there, what is with open source companies, a lot of times there's a core open source technology, but then there's a commercialization that adds extra features. And is there a difference between the Okta implementation and the open source, or what does Okta bring to this technology over the open source?
Yeah. So that's a good question. Right now, from a feature perspective, not much, right? So there's a dashboard you can manage credentials and things like that, and users that can collaborate there. But from a core feature perspective, not much. As Damien was hinting, operating this at a large scale, it's not simple, right? There can be potentially a lot of data and a lot of API calls to the system, right? So what Okta gives you is, we can do that for you. Okay, we can operate this at massive scale, right? And instead of you learning how to do that. However, there's a lot of scenarios and a lot of customers that don't need high scale, right? That they don't have millions of documents, that they don't have thousands of RPS, right? And for them, running it open source is reasonable option, right? So that's the current state. In the future, when I mentioned this integration with the rest of the Okta product, like identity governance, or an Okta directory, or a Auth0 direct tenant, right? There's a lot of data that is created in those systems, like an Okta directory or an Auth0 tenant, that is important when you're making the authorization decisions. So for example, a user is added to our organization in Auth0 or to a role in Auth0. I want to know that in FGA, right? That implies building data synchronization pipelines that we are going to build for those products that are our products in the cloud, right? So if you want to use all the things integrated, it will be easier for you to use the cloud products, because those integrations are going to work out of the box. And if you're using the open source product, you will need to build them and build the data pipelines and connect them and make them run. Right? So it's mostly about operating systems and databases that need to be always working, right? And that's what we want to have on the hosted version, right? And but the features right now are the same. And it might happen at some moment that we create a feature that is only in the SaaS product, but it's not planned yet, right? So it might happen, but right now it's not.
Yeah, and one of the things that Andres is hinting at is, again, like creating an implementation of this has some complexity, then supporting it, running it at scale. Again, like we have blog posts about like how much scale the system can handle, like millions of RPS and so on. So that has kind of like challenges and value in and of itself. Again, we've been building a lot of software at scale, and that has value. And then there's the data story, both the data integration story with Okta Workforce, with Auth0, and as we start gathering data in FGA, in our hosted version, we will be able to build capabilities that we won't be able to offer others in OpenFGA because of the integrations, right? You can think about, hey, if you notice anomalous behavior in an FGA instance, can we provide signals to Auth0 using the shared signals framework and so on? Those are things that, we can get them to work, But because we don't own the data, because we won't be able to kind of like get them in the right place, potentially build models on top of this, we won't be able to do that. And that kind of like network effect of data is going to be powerful in the future for both our Okta FGA customers and also our Auth0 customers, right?
Yeah, if I could ask a follow-up question there about audit logging, because one of the key advantages I see for an authorization framework is you can say not only that I authenticate a person and issue a token to a certain client, but that token was actually presented in the process of making an authorization decision. And in order to get sort of a holistic view of the audit logs, do you see that also as potentially an advantage of, yes, the software is open source, but all of those logs coming out have to be correlated? And do you see audit logging sort of as one of the competitive advantages you can bring as a sort of a enterprise hosted platform of OpenFGA or this technology?
Yeah, so I think that's a use case that Damien was kind of referring to, which is when you use OpenFGA, we know each time a user is trying to access a resource, right? And then we know if it succeeded or if it failed, right? And we also know when someone made a change in the permissions, like I shared this document with you, I added this user to this role, I added this user to this group, right? There are logs for that, okay? So we know when permissions changed, and we know when people are trying to access resources. And that data is very interesting, right? From a point of view of finding out what's going on, of correlating that with other signals we can have in the system to understand anomalous behavior, right? We could say things like, you are over provisioned to your role because you are never accessing things that you have access to, right? Because we know what you have access to and we know what you're accessing. So that data is very interesting. It gives us a lot of opportunity to do interesting things that if you run OpenFGA yourself, we won't have that data, right? The logs, you're going to have your logs yourselves. We cannot manage them, we cannot analyze them, we cannot correlate it with anything, right? And so yes, I think like the part of the audit logs, which on our product still early, right? So we keep them, but we are not using them for anything yet, right? And it is going to become important over time, right?
So I just want to get back to Damien, to the sort of developer adoption part of this. Tuples, I think a lot of developers, when you start to mention triples and building graphs with triples and tuples, their head starts to explode a little bit. So what have been some of the challenges in getting developers over the activation energy for saying, okay, I really like that graph you showed me, but I'm not maybe quite sure how to use it? What are some of the, how do you help developers get over that initial activation energy, and architects for that matter too? Because I think the architects also need to know how to use this tool to figure out, to set the design for a product.
Yeah, it's a bunch of things. First of all, there is no one answer, and everything we're doing is continuously improving. We have, I would say, very good documentation to get started, and we know it can get a lot better. So we're not saying this is the best documentation, but it's fairly good. We have documentation that explains how to model things from scratch. It goes through that exercise using natural language, doing things that are typically, I would say, intuitive for someone that might be like more a senior engineer or an architect thinking about the system, and then how you move from that to an authorization model. We have documentation not about how the system works. You are alluding to tuples, and those are important concepts. But when we were writing the docs, we spent a lot of time thinking about, what am I going to want to do? What's the use case, right? What do I want to do? And start kind of like, let's say, indexing from that perspective and creating content from that perspective. We have a team that does support on Slack for the open source version. We have, again, support, of course, enterprise support for our hosted version. Our sales team does a lot of modeling, and even while we were developing the product, we were getting feedback from architects, from developers in live sessions, right, where they were sharing their authorization model, and we were building it as they spoke. So that's the other thing, is that that show them that while some of this might be nuanced, once you get the concepts, it's very powerful, so that not only us, but they will be able to iterate on things quickly. Um, the usual things, right? SDKs for languages, then SDKs for frameworks, tooling around things, like what you were showing before, right? That was a tool that we created so we could explain concepts to people. That's not a tool that's necessary to run OpenFGA or OctaFGA. That's just something that's there so that someone can learn. And finally, we put together an open resource. It's a site called Zanzibar.academy, and that actually explains the Zanzibar paper and concepts in a way that we hope is easy to grok for people without having to go read an 8-page paper. That's, I wouldn't say it's the most complex, but it's fairly complex. And at the
Yeah.
same time, just do it live online with a step-by-step walkthrough. So it's, again, it's like security. It's a layered approach, but it's one thing that we have fortunately a lot of experience with, having worked with developers for all these years.
Andres, do you see OpenFGA being the Uber authorization solution for an enterprise, or do you see OpenFGA perhaps being one approach used for a certain set of problems, while maybe for another set of problems, a customer might use OPA, for example, Kubernetes access control, and another problem maybe they would choose the 20 other authorization frameworks. So do you see it as the Uber authorization, or as maybe one authorization piece among maybe several that an enterprise might need today?
Yeah. So right now, if I look at the cloud native and the landscape, right, OPA is a very successful product, and mostly for access to Kubernetes resources, right, and things like that, right, for infrastructure scenarios. And I think that's a use case for OPA, where OPA works great. There's not a lot of data that you need when you're making an authorization decision about who can access a Kubernetes pod or cluster or whatever, and that data usually is stored in configuration, changes based on a commit to a specific repository, right? And for those use cases, yeah, you don't need something like OpenFGA, right? Where you can have updated data in real time, where you have handle a lot of data and things like that, right? And in use cases where there's a lot of data, the data changes frequently, and yes, OpenFGA as a solution in general can help. And I think that's the sweet spot for OpenFGA, right? However, we also seen customers that just like the way you can define a model in OpenFGA and find that better or easier than they could do with OPA, right? So Canonical, as I mentioned, is using OpenFGA. So if you're using Ubuntu, you have OpenFGA embedded, right? And they are using it in several pieces of the stack because they like the flexibility of the model, the way that they can define hierarchies of resources and permissions at the right level. They don't have millions of records. They are not updated in real time all the time, right? But they just like the approach. And they pack it with an embedded database, that is running in process. So it's not the core OpenFGA use case that we thought when we built the product, but the approach works well too. Okay, so of course, I will be very arrogant if saying this is the solution for all the products in the world, right? But I think it's going beyond where we thought it will be applicable, right? And we think it can become like as OPA is today, the core or the go-to place to define authorization, even for infrastructure scenarios. Yeah, maybe OpenFGA in the context of the cloud native world, it ends up going that way, right? And to be embedded in more products that are more of the cloud native stack, and it can help implementing authorization better everywhere, right? So,
Damien, I'm going to put you on the spot, and if you have no opinion on this, that's fine. But there's a new OpenID Foundation standard called AuthZen, which is trying to define a standard, I guess, RESTful interface for authorization. Because I guess if you're building a product, it would be nice if we could abstract the authorization call to several different authorization PDPs. Have you looked at that? Do you think it's useful for your community? And just any other thoughts on AuthZen OpenID standard?
Yeah, we looked at it. We gave feedback to one of the earliest draft. I think it was at some point. I don't know if it was early this year or like late last year. Dates gets confused. In terms of, is there value in having a standard for making authorization decisions? 100%, yes. Is the current version of that spec what I think will be a good solution long term? I think it needs work. I think it's not still there, but there's definitely value in also us implementing such a standard so that we can make it easy to integrate with different kind of like tools in the toolbox.
Do you I'm sorry, Andres, go ahead. Yeah, please.
No, because so Damien was involved in the project early, right? And he provided feedback to one of the early drafts. I was involved later, and then and we've seen like there's a draft of the specification that is from early this month that I think incorporates the feedback that Damien had, and we can implement it perfectly well with OpenFGA, and that's the plan, right? So it's something we are going to do. It's not clear yet when, right? I have to had a conversation yesterday when with Omri, one of the guys leading that project, right? And then he was asking me, when are you going to do it? And said, give me a couple of days to tell you that, right? But yes, it's something we are interested in doing. We are following, and I think it's important. It adds value, so yeah, we're going to do it.
It's very, very early. Last time I looked at it, I'm not sure that there's even a spec to actually implement, or if so, it's still embryonic. But performance is really important for an authorization platform. Do you think inserting like a transformation layer to the standard API would that hurt performance, or would you build it straight into as an option for your API and it should be relatively minor?
Yeah, that's the way we are thinking of it, right? So we are going to have an endpoint in the server that exposes that payload, right? That spec, and it's very similar to what we have today. It's just the structure is a little different, the name of the fields and things like that. But conceptually, the query you're going to make is, can this user perform this action on this resource, right? And that's the kind of query you execute on OpenFGA too, right? So I think that's going to be fine. But however, if we think about the OpenFGA APIs, right? That API which is checked in the OpenFGA world, the Zanzibar world, and that is the one we will implement with this spec, is one of the APIs, right? So there are, and in particular in systems like Zanzibar, there's APIs to write state to the system, right? And actually in the application that the AuthZen group is using for interop to proving that the spec can be implemented by several vendors, they already have that, and they have several vendors integrated. Now they're evolving the spec, and they will need to adjust the interop scenario. And we ended up discussing yesterday that yes, there needs to be a way in that interop app to actually call the application-specific APIs to add a state or to change the state in the actual system, right? Because if not, you cannot implement the fully app in a way that it works in systems like are more Zanzibar based.
Well, our deep dive maybe didn't go as deep as we wanted, so I'd encourage people to move to the resources. So the OpenFGA has a really great website with a quick start and documentation. We have a wiki page for this episode where we're going to put takeaways, my personal takeaways from this conversation. Also, we can continue the conversation on the LinkedIn page itself. And I guess before we leave, I'll give some last thoughts. Damien, we'll start with you. Any last thoughts before we call it?
I think you alluded to this towards the end, Mike. The space itself is, I would say, relatively, I don't know if nascent, but it's been reborn. We had specifications for authorization for a while, SACML and so on. With the Zanzibar paper, with the work that we've been doing, with the work that other companies have been doing, it's been kind of like fairly dynamic, right? And the AuthZen spec is one example of that, where we're starting to get something standardized that honestly could have been a long time ago, right? Like the question is always the same: can this user do this specific action on this object? That has always been the case, but it took a while for applications to need this more often. Applications became more collaborative. Authorization became more dynamic and more fine-grained, and that's kind of like where we think we are in terms of like as an industry. It's a very similar spot to where authentication was maybe 10 years ago when Auth0 started, and we're really excited about what's coming next.
Andres, last thoughts?
Yeah, so actually, I think this episode was triggered by me liking or commenting a previous episode that was about empowering authorization through data, right? Which of course clicked with the things we're doing here, in the sense that the way we're thinking about the space is that we need to have a single source of authorization data that we can use to make authorization decisions and to empower or enable governance scenarios, right? So I think that's where the industry is going, like, or where we want it to be going, or where we think it's going to go, right? Let's have a single place where we can have all the data we can use to make operation decisions, and then take advantage of that data in all the ways we've been describing and mentioning today.
Okay, well, I think we're going to wrap here. And I just want to remind everyone, follow Identerati office hours. Join us next week if you're interested in decentralized identity. Dan Robertson wrote a blog about the 3-wallet problem. So wallets are one of the big challenges of decentralized identity. So if you don't know what the 3-wallet problem is, please join us on Friday, not on Thursday this week because of my travels. So thank you, Andres and Damien, so much for joining us. I thought this was a great conversation. And
yeah, thank you. Happy to be here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Okay. And I wish you guys the best of luck. You're doing fantastic work. And thank you for contributing that through the CNCF and open source. So best of luck. And thank you, audience. And we'll see you on Friday.